Some houses are built on foundations of concrete and steel, but this one was constructed on a foundation of hunger. The Miller family arrived at the secluded estate under the cover of a gray, stormy sky, drawn by a rental listing that was suspiciously cheap for such a grand property. Father, mother, and their 2 children stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the house's gaze pressing down on their shoulders like a physical burden. The architecture seemed too organic, with vines choking the brickwork like veins restricting blood flow, and the windows looked like hollow eyes watching their every move with predatory intent. They ignored the unease prickling at the back of their necks, blinded by the desperate need to save money after months of financial struggle and eviction notices. The real estate agent had vanished immediately after handing over the keys, leaving them alone in the driveway with no neighbors for miles around to hear their screams if something went wrong. As they unlocked the front door, the air inside rushed out to meet them, stale and heavy, carrying a scent that was not quite dust but something much older and more visceral. They stepped across the threshold, unaware that they were not entering a home, but walking into the mouth of a beast that had been waiting patiently for fresh meat to sustain its crumbling structure. Unpacking boxes in the main hall, the smell of iron became undeniable, permeating the air like the interior of an old butcher shop left uncleaned for decades. The mother paused, wiping sweat from her brow, wondering if the scent was coming from the old pipes or something far more sinister hidden within the walls. The children ran through the corridors, their laughter echoing strangely, as if the house was absorbing the sound and storing it for later use during the quiet hours of the night. The father dismissed his wife's concerns, attributing the odor to rusted plumbing that they could fix once they were settled, refusing to acknowledge the growing tension in his own chest. Every room they entered felt warmer than the last, a humid heat that clung to their skin like a feverish blanket despite the cool storm raging outside. They ate a cold dinner on the floor, surrounded by cardboard, while the shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen and stretch toward them without a light source to cast them. The house settled around them with groans and creaks that sounded too much like human joints cracking under pressure. They went to sleep early, exhausted from the drive, but none of them truly rested, as the silence of the house felt like a held breath waiting to be exhaled violently upon them. Morning light revealed the first sign of the house's true nature, staining the pristine white wallpaper of the hallway with dark, reddish-brown patches that smelled strongly of copper. The mother screamed when she touched the wall, pulling her hand back to find her fingertips coated in a sticky, viscous fluid that looked and felt exactly like fresh blood. They scrubbed furiously with bleach and soap, watching in horror as the stains vanished only to reappear moments later, spreading wider and darker than before across the plaster. The father tried to rationalize it as a leak from behind the wall, but when he cut into the drywall, there were no pipes, only solid flesh-like material pulsing slightly beneath the surface. The children stopped playing, sensing the danger instinctively, clinging to their parents as the red marks began to form shapes that resembled grasping hands reaching out from the paint. The smell intensified to a gagging level, filling their lungs with the metallic taste of death every time they inhaled the stagnant air of the living room. The house was marking its territory, marking them as livestock designated for slaughter, and there was no way to wash away the scent of prey once it had been identified. They packed bags quickly, deciding to leave immediately, but the front door refused to open, locked tight by an invisible force that held them captive inside. Desperate for an explanation, the father tore up the loose floorboards in the study, finding a leather-bound diary hidden beneath the foundation where the wood met the earth. The pages were brittle and stained with old blood, detailing the mad architect's vision to build a living structure that required life force to maintain its integrity against the decay of time. He read aloud with a trembling voice, learning that the house was not merely haunted but was actually a biological entity that digested its inhabitants to repair its own crumbling bones and beams. The diary listed previous families who had moved in, all of whom were recorded as missing persons, their lives consumed to keep the roof from collapsing and the walls from turning to dust. It stated clearly that the structure needed a specific amount of vitality every decade, and if the offering was not made voluntarily, the house would take it by force through pain and terror. The mother wept as she realized the cheap rent was the bait used to lure victims into the trap, a price paid in blood rather than currency to the landlord who was likely long dead. The The father slammed the book shut, hoping to deny the truth, but the walls around them groaned in agreement, confirming that the words written in the diary were the laws governing their imprisonment. They were not tenants. They were ingredients stored in a pantry waiting to be cooked. As night fell again, the house began to wake fully, the walls starting to pulse with a rhythmic vibration that matched the beating of a massive, slow heart hidden within the structure. They could feel the throbbing through the soles of their feet, a steady boom 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 that shook the furniture and made the pictures on the walls rattle in their frames. The temperature dropped sharply, yet the air remained humid and thick, creating a suffocating atmosphere that made it hard to draw breath without feeling the house inhaling along with them. Sleep was impossible as the noises shifted from creaks to wet, squelching sounds emanating from the ceilings, like muscles stretching and skin rubbing against bone in the dark. The children huddled together in the center of the living room, crying softly, while the parents stood guard with makeshift weapons that felt useless against an enemy that was everywhere around them. The electricity flickered and died, plunging them into darkness, but the walls emitted a faint, bioluminescent glow that revealed the veins running through the plaster like a map of a circulatory system. They realized the house was alive in the most literal sense, a monstrous organism that had grown around them while they slept, wrapping its internal organs around their fragile human bodies. The heartbeat grew louder, drowning out their own pulses, sinking them to the rhythm of the building that intended to consume them whole. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath them cracked open with the sound of snapping bones, revealing deep fissures from which fresh, bright red blood began to drip steadily onto the carpet below. The father slipped in the pooling liquid, falling to his knees, his hands soaking in the warm fluid that was definitely human blood and not any kind of plumbing leak or chemical spill. The cracks widened, forming a mouth-like shape in the center of the room, exhaling a hot breath that smelled of iron and old graves where bodies had been buried without ceremony. The mother tried to pull the children away, but the floor felt sticky, trapping their shoes like flypaper designed to catch insects too slow to escape the predator's reach. Blood began to seep from the ceiling as well, raining down on them, soaking their clothes and hair, marking them physically as property of the house that claimed ownership over their biology. They screamed for help, but the sound was absorbed by the walls, dampened by the flesh-like material that lined the interior to keep the noise contained within its digestive tract. The house was feeding time, preparing the environment to make the extraction of life force easier and less resistant to its will. The blood rose around their ankles, warm and thick, pulling them downward toward the cracks that promised a painful end beneath the foundation of the cursed estate. Through the haze of blood and terror, translucent figures began to materialize in the corners of the room, the ghosts of previous tenants who had failed to escape the hunger of the living house. They did not look angry or violent, but instead wore expressions of profound sorrow and pity, their eyes hollowed out by years of torment within the structural confines of the building. The mother recognized faces from the missing persons posters she had seen in town, realizing these spirits were the families who had vanished without a trace over the last century. They pointed silently at the walls and the floor, trying to communicate the mechanics of the curse without voices that could be heard over the pounding heartbeat of the structure. The ghosts drifted closer, their forms flickering like dying light bulbs, reaching out with cold hands to touch the children's faces in a gesture that felt like a final blessing before death. They were not there to scare the family further, but to warn them that resistance was futile and that the house had already made its selection for the main course of its meal. The spirits mouthed words that the parents could read on their lips, repeating the same phrase over and over again in a silent chorus of doom that echoed in their minds. They were part of the house now, bound to warn the next victims even though no one ever listened to the warnings until it was too late. The lead ghost, a woman with a gaping wound in her chest, stepped forward and pointed directly at the youngest child, indicating that he had been chosen as the primary sacrifice to sustain the structure. The parents screamed in denial, throwing themselves in front of their son, begging the spirits to take them instead to spare the innocent boy from the horrific fate awaiting him. The ghosts shook their heads sadly, explaining through gestures that the house preferred young life force because it was potent and pure, capable of repairing the deepest cracks in the foundation for another decade. The mother grabbed a knife from the kitchen, threatening to destroy the walls, but the spirits warned that violence against the house would only accelerate the digestion process and cause more pain. The father tried to bargain with the entity, offering his own life, but the floor beneath the child began to soften, turning into a liquid membrane that reached up to grab his ankles gently but firmly. The house was not negotiating. It was harvesting, and it had decided that the boy's vitality was exactly what was needed to stabilize the roof that was currently sagging under its own weight. The ghosts faded slightly, their warning delivered, leaving the family alone to face the physical manifestation of the curse that demanded its payment in flesh and blood immediately. Panic reached its peak as the parents grabbed the child and ran for the front door, slamming against the wood that had turned hard as stone and refused to budge even with their combined strength. The windows were sealed shut with a layer of transparent membrane that looked like glass but felt like skin, unbreakable and impervious to the hammer they swung against it in desperation. The walls began to contract, moving inward slowly like the muscles of a throat swallowing food, reducing the space in the room and pushing them closer to the blood-filled cracks in the floor. They were trapped in a living organism that was closing its jaws, and every step they took sank deeper into the carpet, which had become soft and spongy like gum tissue. The air grew thin, making them gasp for oxygen, while the heartbeat of the house became deafening, vibrating in their chests and threatening to stop their own hearts from the sheer pressure of the rhythm. The child cried out as the floor pulled him down, his legs disappearing into the wood which had turned to liquid flesh, swallowing him inch by inch despite his father's desperate grip on his hands. The house was claiming its due, and no amount of human struggle could override the ancient biological imperative that drove the building to feed on the life within it. They were powerless, reduced to prey caught in a trap that had been set long before they were born into this world. In the end, the house consumed its offering, pulling the child completely beneath the floorboards while the parents were absorbed into the walls, their screams silenced as they became part of the structure forever. The blood receded back into the cracks, the walls stopped pulsing, and the smell of iron vanished, replaced by the scent of fresh paint and new wood as the house repaired itself completely. Silence returned to the estate, a peaceful quiet that hid the horror of what had just occurred beneath the surface of the polished floors and clean wallpaper. Outside, the storm cleared, and the sun rose on a beautiful morning, making the house look inviting and pristine to any passerby who might drive down the secluded road. A new sign was placed in the front yard the next day, advertising the rent as suspiciously cheap for such a grand property in a quiet neighborhood. The cycle was ready to begin again, waiting for the next struggling family to answer the ad and walk into the mouth of the beast without knowing the true cost of living there. The ghosts watched from within the walls, silent and sorrowful, waiting to warn the next victims who would inevitably ignore the signs until the house woke up hungry once more. The house slept, digesting its meal, ready to wake when the next living soul drew near to claim its blood and vitality for survival. Alara stood in the dimly lit hallway of her grandmother's sprawling estate, the air thick with the heavy scent of dust, decay, and dried lavender that failed to mask the smell of death lingering in the corners. In her trembling hands, she held the heavy velvet cloth that covered the antique Victorian mirror, a monstrous piece of furniture with a frame carved from dark ebony wood that seemed to absorb the surrounding shadows aggressively. The house had been suffocatingly silent since the funeral, an oppressive silence that seemed to press physically against her eardrums whenever she moved through the creaking floorboards of the old mansion. She pulled the cloth away slowly, revealing the glass which seemed to swallow the dim light rather than reflect it back into the room like a normal surface. It was said that her grandmother never allowed anyone to look into it for too long, a strict rule Alara had previously dismissed as mere elderly superstition born from loneliness and fear. Now, standing before it in the gloom, she felt a cold chill crawl up her spine, distinct and separate from the drafty windows of the old house that rattled in the wind. The reflection showed her pale, tired face, but the eyes in the glass seemed slightly darker, slightly more hollow than her own living eyes staring back. She reached out to touch the cold glass, expecting the chill of winter, but instead, it felt uncomfortably warm, like human skin feverish with a severe illness spreading through the veins. She decided to hang it in her bedroom, completely unaware that she was inviting an ancient predator into her personal sanctuary where she slept every night. The wood creaked loudly as she positioned it against the wall, sounding almost like a sigh of relief from the object itself, as if it had been waiting for her arrival for decades. That night, sleep eluded her as the moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows across the bedroom floor, creating shapes that looked like grasping hands reaching for her ankles under the covers. Alara tossed and turned under the heavy quilt, feeling as though unseen eyes were tracking her every movement in the darkness with malicious intent and patience. Every time she drifted toward unconsciousness, a sharp noise like fingernails dragging on glass would jolt her back to wakefulness, making her heart pound violently against her ribs. She sat up, squinting into the darkness, trying to locate the source of the disturbing sound that echoed in her mind and seemed to come from the corner of the room. The mirror stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow, yet she could feel its presence radiating a malevolent energy that made her hair stand on end and her breath catch in her throat. She convinced herself it was the wind, or the old house settling, anything to avoid acknowledging the fear tightening in her chest like a vice grip. Finally, exhaustion won, and she fell into a deep, dreamless slumber that felt more like a coma than rest, heavy and suffocating in its depth. When morning light finally filtered through the curtains, she stumbled toward the bathroom to wash her face, avoiding the large mirror in her bedroom out of instinct. However, upon returning to dress, she glanced inadvertently at the Victorian glass and froze in absolute terror, her blood running cold in her veins. Her reflection was standing there, but it looked as though it hadn't slept in weeks, with dark circles bruising the skin beneath its eyes in a way that looked painful. She touched her own face, which felt rested, but the image in the glass looked exhausted, staring back at her with a resentment that felt deeply personal and wrong. Over the next few days, the discrepancy between Alara's physical state and her reflection grew increasingly disturbing and impossible to ignore as the hours ticked by slowly. While she felt healthy and energized, going about her daily routine with normalcy, the woman in the mirror appeared to be deteriorating rapidly before her very eyes in the glass. Deep purple bruises began to bloom on the reflection's neck and arms, marks that Alara did not possess on her own tangible skin anywhere on her body. She started covering the mirror with a sheet during the day, but the feeling of being watched persisted, following her from room to room like a stalking shadow that never left her side. At night, the noises intensified, shifting from scratches to low, guttural whispers that seemed to emanate from the glass surface itself and vibrate through the walls. She tried to leave the house, packing a bag to stay at a hotel, but every time she reached the front door, an overwhelming sense of dread forced her back inside against her will. It was as if an invisible wall blocked her exit, compelling her to return to the bedroom where the mirror waited patiently for her return. Her reflection began to mimic her movements with a slight delay, like a lagging video feed, sometimes smiling when Alara was crying uncontrollably. The psychological toll began to fracture her sanity, making her question whether she was the real person or just an image trapped in a physical body walking around. The bruises on the reflection started to bleed in the glass, red streaks running down the silver surface that did not exist in reality but looked terrifyingly real. Desperate for answers, Alara searched her grandmother's study, digging through dusty journals and locked drawers until she found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath the loose floorboards under the desk. The handwriting was shaky and frantic, detailing the history of the mirror and the dark entity bound within its silvered depths by ancient and forbidden rituals. Her grandmother wrote of a sacrifice required to keep the spirit contained, a blood offering that had been neglected since her illness began to take hold of her frail body. The pages described how the mirror did not show reality, but rather a hungry void that desired to consume life force to manifest in the physical world permanently. Alara read about previous owners who had vanished without a trace, their bodies never found, only their reflections remaining trapped in the glass forever as prisoners of the spirit. The diary warned that once the reflection shows injuries, the swap has already begun, and the entity is feeding on the owner's vitality to strengthen itself for the final takeover. She realized with horror that the bruises on her reflection were actually wounds being transferred from the spirit to her future self in a gradual process of replacement. The final entry was a plea for forgiveness, admitting that the grandmother had tried to pass the curse to Alara to save herself from being dragged into the abyss of the mirror. The house suddenly grew colder, the temperature dropping below freezing as if the heating system had failed completely in the middle of the night. She dropped the diary, hearing the mirror frame crack loudly from the other room, signaling that the entity knew she had discovered the truth about its nature. That evening, the atmosphere in the house shifted from oppressive to actively hostile, with objects moving on their own and lights flickering violently without any electrical cause. Alara barricaded herself in the bedroom, holding a hammer she intended to use to shatter the cursed glass into a million pieces to end the nightmare forever. The mirror stood uncovered, the reflection now looking like a corpse, with skin gray and eyes entirely black without any whites visible to distinguish them from the darkness. As she raised the hammer, her arm froze in midair, controlled by an invisible force that locked her muscles in place against her will and command. The reflection in the mirror slowly raised its own hand, mirroring her pose, but instead of a hammer, it held a sharp shard of glass ready to strike. A voice echoed in her head, not spoken but felt, demanding her blood as the price for freedom from the prison of the glass that held it captive. She tried to scream, but her throat closed up, silenced by the supernatural pressure filling the room like heavy water drowning her lungs. The reflection stepped forward, not staying within the frame, but physically pushing against the surface like soft rubber beginning to bulge outward dangerously. Alara struggled against the paralysis, tears streaming down her face, as she watched the entity emerge inch by inch from its two-dimensional home into her world. The smell of copper and old blood filled her nostrils, overwhelming her senses and making her gag on the metallic taste in the air around her. She realized too late that breaking the mirror would not kill the spirit, but simply release it completely without any boundaries to hold it back. The night reached its peak of terror when Alara finally woke up from a forced unconsciousness to see the impossible standing before her bed in the dark. The reflection was no longer inside the glass but was standing outside of it, smiling wildly with a mouth full of fresh, bright red blood that dripped onto the carpet. It wore her clothes, it had her face, but the expression was one of pure predatory joy that Alara had never worn in her life during her happiest moments. The entity looked down at her with pity and hunger, wiping a streak of blood from its chin with a trembling hand that looked exactly like her own. Alara tried to scramble backward across the floor, but her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if she were moving through thick mud that slowed her down. The thing that looked like her began to scratch the glass from the inside, even though it was standing outside, creating a paradox that hurt her eyes to witness physically. Identical bloody scratches began to appear on Alara's own skin, burning like acid wherever the invisible nails dragged across her flesh without touching it. She screamed in agony as deep gashes opened on her arms, bleeding profusely onto the carpet without any physical cause visible to the naked eye of any observer. The entity leaned closer, whispering that the vessel was ready and the exchange was nearly complete according to the ancient rules written in the diary. The room spun around her, the boundaries between reality and the mirror world blurring until she could not tell which side was which anymore. Pain became the only reality as the bloody scratches deepened into open wounds that poured life onto the floorboards in rivulets of crimson. Alara felt her strength draining away with every drop of blood, feeding the entity that stood towering over her weakening form like a dark god. The reflection reached out and grabbed her by the throat, its grip cold as ice yet burning like fire against her skin simultaneously. She looked into its eyes and saw no soul, only a bottomless void that wanted to consume everything she had ever been and everything she would become. The entity spoke again, its voice sounding like Alara's own but distorted by pain and malice, telling her that resistance was futile against such power. It explained that the mirror was a door, and blood was the key that unlocked the passage between the spirit realm and the living world permanently. Alara tried to bite the hand holding her, but her teeth passed through it like smoke, confirming it was no longer fully physical but something else entirely. The blood on the floor began to move on its own, crawling toward the mirror like snakes returning to their nest after a hunt. She realized the blood wasn't just spilling. It was being drawn into the glass to pave the way for the final transition of souls. Her vision began to blur, the edges of the room turning dark as death approached to claim her exhausted body for the spirit. In her final moments of clarity, Alara understood the true nature of the curse and the cruel trick played by her grandmother who wanted to survive death. The mirror didn't want to kill her. It wanted to wear her, to use her life as a suit of flesh to walk among the living without suspicion. The entity dragged her toward the glass, her body sliding effortlessly across the floor as if gravity had shifted in favor of the spirit completely. She clawed at the carpet, leaving bloody trails behind, but her strength was gone, replaced by a cold numbness spreading through her veins rapidly. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, losing its solidity as the boundary between the worlds dissolved completely in the pool of blood on the floor. The entity pushed her forward, and she felt herself falling not down, but into the glass, into a cold, silent dimension where no sound existed at all. She saw the room from the other side, watching her own body stand up and wipe the blood from its face with a satisfied smile of victory. She tried to scream from inside the glass, but no sound came out, only the silent movement of a mouth trapped behind silver and magic. The entity, now in her body, turned to look at the mirror, waving goodbye to the prisoner it had just created in the glass. The coldness inside the mirror was absolute, a frozen purgatory where time did not move and hope did not exist for her anymore. From within the prison of the glass, Alara watched as her body walked out of the room, leaving the door open to the rest of the house and the world outside. She pounded on the surface from the inside, but her fists made no sound and left no marks on the impenetrable barrier that separated them. Other faces began to appear behind her in the darkness of the mirror world, ghosts of previous victims trapped in the same eternal silence and despair. They pointed at her with pity, showing her their own wounds, indicating that she would remain here until she found another soul to take her place in the living world. The entity outside had complete control over her life, her memories, and her relationships, wearing her identity like a stolen coat that fit perfectly. She saw her body pick up the diary and throw it into the fireplace, destroying the only evidence of the curse that bound them to the mirror forever. The flames reflected in the glass, but she felt no warmth, only the eternal chill of the spirit realm that now claimed her as its own property. She realized that her grandmother was likely in here too, somewhere in the deep shadows, watching silently as the cycle continued uninterrupted by death. The reflection in the glass was now her reality, a flat, two-dimensional existence devoid of touch, taste, or smell forever. She was alone, yet surrounded by the silent screams of others who had failed to escape the mirror's hungry grasp over the centuries. The story ends with the entity walking out of the house into the bright morning sun, feeling the warmth on skin that no longer belonged to it but served its purpose perfectly. Neighbors waved hello, unaware that the woman smiling back at them was a monster wearing a human face soaked in dried blood from the night before. Inside the house, the mirror stood clean and pristine, showing only the empty room behind it with no reflection visible at all for anyone who entered. Alara was gone from the world of the living, reduced to a mere image waiting for the next unsuspecting heir to inherit the estate and the curse. The entity hummed a tune as it drove away, planning to find a new home where it could continue its existence without fear of discovery or exorcism. The curse had been fulfilled, the blood sacrifice accepted, and the cycle of terror was ready to begin again with a new victim in a different city. In the silence of the bedroom, the velvet cloth lay on the floor, waiting to be picked up by the next person foolish enough to uncover the glass and look inside. The house settled into silence once more, hiding its secret behind closed doors and drawn curtains to protect the mirror. The mirror waited patiently, a hungry predator sleeping in the dark, ready to wake when the next living soul drew near to claim its blood. Some moments are meant to remain undeveloped, hidden forever in the darkness where secrets sleep safely away from prying human eyes and curious lenses. David, an aspiring photographer with a penchant for vintage equipment, stumbled upon the box of undeveloped film at a cluttered estate sale held in the pouring rain. The seller, an elderly woman with eyes clouded by cataracts, warned him softly not to look too closely at the negatives. But curiosity is a poison that photographers often drink willingly. He bought the box for a handful of cash, feeling the weight of the canisters in his pocket like heavy stones dragging him toward a destiny he could not yet see. The drive home was silent, the radio static interfering with the music, creating a sense of unease that settled in the car around him. He told himself it was just old film, likely expired decades ago, containing nothing more than faded birthdays and blurry vacations from a forgotten era. However, the box felt cold to the touch, colder than the rainy weather outside, as if it had been stored in a freezer rather than a dusty attic. He parked in his driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled, unaware that he had just purchased a collection of death warrants wrapped in light-proof paper and sealed in metal canisters waiting to be opened. Inside his home, the darkroom was his sanctuary, a place where reality was constructed through chemicals and light under the safety of a dim red bulb that cast long shadows. He locked the door behind him, sealing himself in with the scent of acetic acid and fixer that usually calmed his nerves but tonight smelled sharply metallic like old pennies. His hands trembled slightly as he loaded the first roll onto the developing reel, the plastic clicking softly in the absolute silence of the light-tight room. He submerged the tank into the chemicals, listening to the liquid swirl around the film, imagining the latent images waking up from their long slumber in the dark. Time moved slowly during the development process, each minute stretching into an hour as he agitated the tank with rhythmic motions that felt like a ritual rather than a procedure. He waited for the perfect moment to open the tank, holding his breath as he lifted the lid under the safe light. The wet film hung from the clip, dripping developer onto the floor, the negatives appearing as ghostly inverses of reality that held secrets within their grainy structure. He clipped the strip into the enlarger, focusing the lens on the photographic paper, ready to reveal the first image to the world after decades of hiding. The first image began to materialize in the developer tray, the white paper turning gray as the picture of a smiling family gathering emerged from the chemical bath. It looked like a normal summer picnic from the 90s, with children running on grass and parents laughing under a bright sun that was captured perfectly in black and white. However, as the details sharpened, a figure became visible standing directly behind the father, a tall shadowy form that did not belong to any guest at the party. The figure was covered in what looked like dark wounds, streaks of black fluid dripping from its hands onto the shoulders of the unsuspecting man in the photo. David leaned closer, squinting through his magnifying loupe, feeling a chill run down his spine as he realized the fluid looked too much like blood even in monochrome. The family in the photo seemed oblivious to the monster standing inches from their necks, frozen in a moment of joy while death waited patiently behind them. He pulled the print out and pinned it to the wire, watching the water drip from the corner like a tear shed by the paper itself. Something was wrong with the lighting in the picture, as if the shadow had its own light source that contradicted the sun shining above the happy group. He developed the second roll with faster hands, driven by a morbid curiosity that outweighed the growing fear tightening in his chest like a vice. This photo showed a wedding couple cutting a cake, their faces beaming with hope for the future, but the same tall figure stood behind the bride. The entity was clearer this time, its face a blurred mask of agony, with wounds that looked fresh and weeping across its chest and arms. David counted the rolls in the box, realizing there were enough photos to document the lives of dozens of different families across the city over several years. Each negative revealed the same predatory presence lurking in the background of happy memories, waiting for the perfect moment to strike without being seen by the human eye. The darkroom felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the red light seemed to pulse in rhythm with his accelerating heartbeat. He touched the wet print, the chemicals staining his fingertips brown, wondering if the blood on the photo could transfer to his skin through the paper. The silence of the room was broken by the hum of the ventilation fan, which sounded strangely like whispering voices arguing in a language he could not understand. He knew he should stop, but the need to see the full story compelled him to continue developing the rest of the rolls. As the third and fourth rolls were processed, recognition began to dawn on him with a sickening clarity that made his stomach turn over in nausea. He recognized the park in the background of the picnic photo, a local spot he had visited himself just last summer for a community event. The wedding venue was a famous hall downtown that his own sister had considered for her ceremony before choosing a different location instead. These were not random strangers from the past, but people who lived in his city, neighbors who walked the same streets and bought groceries from the same stores. He laid the wet photos out on the drying rack, arranging them by date, noticing that the appearances of the figure correlated with specific neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. The entity seemed to be hunting systematically, moving from house to house, marking its victims in the film before the actual event took place in reality. David grabbed his phone, searching for names he remembered from the local community boards, finding matches for some of the faces in the photographs. His breath hitched in his throat as he realized the implications of what he was holding in his hands was not just art but evidence of a serial predation spanning decades. The camera had captured something the human eye missed, recording the moment the soul was marked for death. Morning light filtered through the blinds of his apartment, illuminating the dried photographs that hung like flags of surrender on the line across the darkroom. David had not slept, his eyes burning from exhaustion, as he opened the morning news application on his phone with trembling fingers. The headline screamed about a series of unexplained deaths discovered overnight. Bodies found drained of blood in their homes without any signs of forced entry or struggle. He scrolled through the articles, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird, matching the faces in the news reports to the faces on his wet photographs from the night before. Every single person depicted in the developed negatives was listed among the deceased, killed exactly as the wounds on the ghostly figure suggested in the images. The police were baffled, calling it a mystery, but David held the proof that something supernatural was harvesting lives through the lens of this cursed camera film. He looked at the photo of the picnic family, now knowing they were dead, and felt a surge of guilt for developing the images as if he had activated the curse by looking at them. The news anchor spoke calmly about the investigation, unaware that the key to the mystery was hanging in a dark room down the street. David realized he was the only person who knew the truth, and that knowledge made him a target for whatever entity was hunting. The connection between the photos and the deaths was undeniable, suggesting that the film did not just predict the future, but perhaps mandated it through some ancient magical contract. David paced the floor of his living room, the photographs spread out on the table like a map of a killing field that covered the entire city. He wondered if the act of developing the images completed the ritual, bringing the ghostly figure from the latent state into the physical world to claim its due. The entity in the photos seemed to grow closer in each subsequent roll, moving from the background to the midground, indicating its hunger was increasing with every soul it consumed. He thought about destroying the photos, burning them in the sink, but fear paralyzed him, telling him that destruction might anger the spirit further and accelerate the final phase. The house felt watched, every creak of the floorboards sounding like footsteps approaching his door from the hallway outside. He checked the locks twice, then 3 times, knowing that physical barriers would not stop a being that could exist within a two-dimensional image. The air in the room grew cold, the temperature dropping rapidly despite the heating system running full blast to combat the morning chill. He understood that the box of film was a trap designed to find a new observer, a new witness to carry the curse forward to the next stage of the cycle. There was one roll left in the box, the final canister that he had set aside because his instinct screamed at him to leave it sealed in the dark. His hands shook violently as he loaded the last film into the tank, the plastic feeling slippery like skin under his sweaty palms. He told himself he needed to know the end of the story, that understanding the pattern might save him from the fate that befell the others in the pictures. The chemicals seemed to bubble more aggressively this time, hissing like snakes as he agitated the tank with hurried, jerky movements that splashed developer onto his apron. He waited the required minutes, counting seconds that felt like hours, dread pooling in his stomach like acid waiting to burn through his insides. When he finally opened the tank, the strip of film felt heavier than the others, dense with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up instantly. He clipped the negative into the enlarger, his breath catching in his throat as he focused the lens on the final piece of photographic paper. The red light seemed to dim, the shadows in the corners of the room lengthening toward the easel where the image was about to reveal itself. He pressed the timer button, the light buzzing as it exposed the paper, sealing his fate in silver halide crystals. The final image emerged slowly in the tray, the shapes forming with a clarity that was terrifyingly sharp compared to the grainy quality of the previous photographs. It was a picture of his own darkroom, taken from the corner of the room where no camera had been placed during the development process. In the center of the frame stood David himself, looking down at the developing tray, unaware of the figure standing directly behind his back in the reflection of the mirror. The ghostly entity was no longer in the background, but was physically touching him, its bloody hand reaching around his neck in a grip that looked tight and possessive. The wounds on his wound were glowing now, even in black and white, emitting a light that cast shadows opposite to the red safe light in the room. David looked from the photo to the mirror in his actual darkroom, seeing the reflection of the room behind him was empty, yet the photo showed the monster clearly. The discrepancy between reality and the image shattered his mind, making him question which version of the world was the true one and which was the illusion. The hand in the photo was inches from his throat, and he could feel a phantom pressure tightening around his windpipe as he stared at the wet print. The entity had moved from the film into the room, bridging the gap between the image and the living world completely. David dropped the tongs, the metal clattering loudly on the floor, signaling the end of his development process and the beginning of his final moments alive. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath visible in the air as the shadows detached themselves from the walls to surround him completely. He tried to run for the door, but his legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by an invisible force that held him fast like a floating anchor. The photo on the tray continued to develop, the image of the ghost's hand becoming darker and more solid as the real pressure on his throat increased simultaneously. He realized the camera had not just recorded the past, but had captured his future, a future that was now arriving ahead of schedule to collect its debt. The last thing he saw was the reflection in the mirror changing, the empty space behind him filling with the tall, wounded figure that smiled with a mouth full of needles. The news tomorrow would report another unexplained death, a photographer found in his darkroom drained of blood, with a look of absolute terror frozen on his face. The box of film would remain on the table, waiting for the next curious soul to find it at the next estate sale where his belongings would be auctioned off.